from Professor Barbados' situating of this book, this writing of our history, writing in terms of building a discipline as well as asserting an activism, to Professor Fox's contemplation of what it means for us in the Caribbean to claim and create a feminist space for theorizing, to Dr. Gosan's contemplation of what this text means for her in terms of the value of having this genealogy of writing on Indo-Caribbean women and feminism available to students and future scholars. And then to Mr. Mulida's contemplation of masculinity. What do these contemplations say to him as a filmmaker and a creative artist himself? And then Dr. McPhee's examination of the questions triggered as she evaluates frameworks as she herself asked. And finally, Professor Gosan drawing our attention to cultural elements that are always ever present in Professor Mohammed's work. We then open the floor for conversation. But let me say two things. You will engage with the presenters and what they have said and their own musings, but think of this as a book club. We're sitting, we're having a conversation. We cannot provide the wine, but if you have it in your fridge, go grab a glass. And we're going to have a conversation around these ideas that are shared. To make your point, ask a question, comment, etc. You can drop it in the chat, or you could put your hand up and share your view. We welcome you. We will be talking for a little bit of time, and we will signal when we have about 3 minutes and then 1 minute left. So for now, it's my pleasure to open the floor to all of our participants. Share your views in the chat or put your hand up and speak your truth, your understanding.
Maybe I'll just jump in to get things started. You know, I would really love to hear a little bit from Pat, because one of the things I'm always struck by, and I mentioned in my little piece, is the incredible versatility. And I know, that kind of interdisciplinarity is not unusual in the Caribbean. It's a feature of the field. But of course, it is not still the kind of dominant approach in academia. And I was wondering if you talk a little bit about, your trajectory, because we both did development studies degrees at one point, and then, you end up in this world of culture and art. And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about that transition, that development, particularly going from, working on pragmatic things, on policy, and then thinking about aesthetics and the abstract.
Chair, before Pat starts, I want to say something on piggybacking on Professor Gosan's comment, which would, and to say that one of the things that I've admired about Pat over a very long and productive friendship and my love of this woman is that she is not afraid to grapple with different issues and different areas. And she just steps out and engages. And so when he just speaks about how she makes those transitions, I think Pat is bold and brave, personally and as a scholar and as an intellectual. And I think it just sets her up to get into it. And I didn't have time to go into sugar in my coffee, but I really love that piece and the fact that it engaged with tensions in Caribbean feminism. And again, the strength and courage of putting that on the table and engaging in so many different areas of scholarship. And that's why I said eclectic. But over to you, Pat. I thought that my comment would fit very nicely, Professor Gosan, after yours.
Thank you, colleagues. I really didn't want to make this about me, although book launches are always about the author. And everyone has been so glowing, so that it feels as if I'm adding to that kind of self, affirmation, but I don't mean to be like it. I think really, I'm interested in everything. I'm just, everything, that every new thing is an adventure to explore. I think we live in a space that we live in the world, and we are given all these you know, we will only touch a minute section of it. We already know so much. But if we allow ourselves, then we gain so much from it. And I remember, just to give you an example, I mean, I'm traveling as though I always do. My brain travels too much, which is why it's very difficult for me to be a speaker, and I'm a better writer. Figure that out. So I remember once Michelle Rowley and I were talking, and she showed me one of those I think it's a necklace with a pendant from Christopher, the travel saint. And I looked at it and I thought, and I looked at the design, and then I said, I wonder why that is so. And I was ready to engage with it immediately. And Michelle looked at me and she said, that's why the way you are the way you are. Because, you know, the fact it was Christian didn't mean anything other to me than I needed to know about it. And maybe that is just what it is, about being exploratory. And also, the exploration is rooted in questions. They're not just why. They're about a question that it raises about culture, about gender, about people's aesthetic. Why I'm interested in aesthetics perhaps is because I think about how we are faced with a visual world in which this is so much part of us, but we still do not see under the skin. And I keep thinking the aesthetic is the next boundary we have to cross in human consciousness, if we have to see beyond it. I don't know how to get there, but I think that is where we have to, because otherwise we have these, I call them constipated concepts that we keep going back and forth with, and we do not move beyond it. And it has to be almost like, you know, becoming a Martian and seeing differently. So I don't know if that explains it. The other thing, of course, Angela, one last point is that, you know, we have so much, so culturally we have so many arts, and when you decide you like this because you ethnically have to like it, and you don't open yourself up to something else, you do not see the beauty of it, and you do not, and by not seeing that, you are not able to embrace them. And I think culture moves because people have always done that. I find musicians are the most exciting ones in doing that. Musicians do not, when musicians get together, they forget what their color and race is, they do music. And it almost seems as, and that is the thing that eludes me actually, but I see it. So maybe that's one way of saying it. And thank you for asking this question. Over to you all. I think you all have other things you've not said. So
thank you, Prof. In fact, we have Professor Byron, who not only do I see your hand, but I see your nods. So feel free to jump in.
Thank you very much. I put that hand back down. Good evening, everybody, and special greetings to Pat and to family members, Mr. Mohammed and others. And Pat, congratulations. And listening to everybody talking, it took me back to years ago in Jamaica when you were thinking through and writing some of those essays. And well, you've always used your friends as your sounding boards. And we have talked through and argued through some of the ideas. And I was taken back 20 years to, in a couple of the pieces that were spoken about, like I Love Me Browning and so on, a long, long time, when I think both of us were trying to understand some aspects of Jamaican society at that time. I wanted to mention that, and I also wanted to say that there are a few things that I have enjoyed reading more than the piece on Eric Williams, a very public-private man. And I've, just like Michael, and I've enjoyed it for two reasons. One, because it walks you through a particular part of political history in a very, because Eric Williams' grandparents came from Nevis, and the migrated, I think his grandmother migrated to Trinidad around the mid-1800s. And this was fascinating because it also brings in another very important part of Caribbean history, how we have moved, the mobility and the exchanges, and how we have learned so much from one another and contributed to different societies in the process. So I like that piece very much because of that as well. And it helped me to learn more about the place I come from as well. And I just wanted to say, I'm not going to engage in any great intellectualizing of the book. I think it's a very valuable contribution. I look forward to reading all the parts of the collection that I'm not yet familiar with. And congratulations again. And there was one more thing I wanted to say. My brain sort of freezes over program evaluations and those horrible aspects of policy analysis that we have to do from time to time. But I must say that in our discussions on gender policy, you have always had this art of bringing things down to people and how people relate to one another, and how to figure out what are the most important things for the well-being of individuals and groups in a community. And that's what policy should be about. So, all the best.
Jessica, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Byron. And as the panelists continue to contemplate, let's invite more of the audience through a question I know Professor Mohammed would ask. What are your thoughts on what these writings of gender in the Caribbean tell us? What do they say to us? What do they say about us? And I believe I see Judith Weatherburn's hand up.
And remember, we had some people who didn't finish, so we have to come back to them.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pat.
Hi, Judy.
I'm so pleased and honored to be here. I have to make 2 points to thank you, Pat, for a very important part of my learning by doing experience, which is really how I came into gender studies, when we participated in a week-long session in Trinidad and Tobago. And out of that came a manual on gender-sensitive policymaking, which has guided my work. And we turned it into what do you call it? A CD. That's how long ago it was. And I was able to use it in my work as head of FES with a range of women's organizations, government people. So I really am indebted to you for that. Secondly, being exposed to your wider scope of work in our very gendered lives as women and men. To me, you were teaching us very early what gender mainstreaming is all about. It is present in every single aspect of our lives. And unfortunately, in these days, as I'm morphed into another part of the gender policy work, I'm very sensitive that that is lacking in that understanding that gender, relations of power, and all of those interrelated issues are very much a part of the what is the word I want? The fabric of our lives. And gender mainstreaming these days, as I'm seeing it evolve, is not representing that. So thank you very much, Pat. I continue to be inspired and encouraged, and to thank for all the contributors to the book and the persons who speak today. It gives me hope. Thank you so much.
Indeed, and we are so pleased that we all find hope through Prof. Mohammed's words. I did interrupt some of our speakers as they were presented, and as we wait for people to get a little brave to share their views, I want to turn back to Dr. McPhee and then Mr. Mulidar to just give us some final points that we missed as you were presenting. Dr. McPhee?
I'm feeding off of Miss Wedderburn's contribution. When I look at Professor Mohammed speaking about the border crossing within the policy process, and one of the major push Prof. Mohammed has always sought to engage in is the fact that the policy process is a capacity building and a capacity sharing process. And the outcome is a policy document, whatever it may be. And we have a very clear model. And when she speaks in the chapter that speaks to the gender sensitivity of nations, it is very clear that she speaks to the fact that every nation will have a different process. And these are important aspects of the work. But I also wanted to say that there are things that knit the processes, the regional processes together. And part of that is the partnerships that are formed in the process and the ways in which at different points in the process, we disrupt the idea of the expert. And so when I speak to the framework and the construction of the frameworks, I think it's very important that we challenge what we see going on today in terms of one individual doing a range of work. We need to build the teams that came to build the gender sensitivity of nations that we speak to in chapter 15. And that was one point that I really think that we need to reflect on going forward in this work. We need to challenge global governance around that. And I'll pause here, Dr. Barrett.
Indeed, I think it's valuable. And I see Professor Fox nodding vigorously in agreement. So I'm going to turn to her to continue and then move on to Michael.
Thank you. Well, throughout all this conversation, I keep returning to the point that Eudine made early on about the chapter on Creole identity, which I saw as and read as kind of a metaphor for the problems of reduction of language, the terminologies that we use to try to describe what are fluid and changing processes, and the ways in which so many of you spoke about Pat's amazing ability, Pat, to weave together these different genres and forms in writing to create a writing that is really a bricolage, a vibrant sort of a painting in itself. But I think that we still have to struggle with language, and I often think when I'm going to a museum, you know, of all the complexities, the whole history of collections themselves, which emerged out of the colonial process, but then the joy and upliftment of being in a museum and engaging with a piece of art, the relationship between the piece of art and the play card that describes it. And all of these are bounded ideas, the coloniality of collections, the play card, the painting, but we have to find a way to create language that contains within it these broad understandings that don't force us into reductions. And so one of the thoughts that I wanted to share is my thinking about the future of using the concept of queering feminisms. And I know that in the Caribbean, there's a complicated response to this idea of queerness. There's discomfort, but it's also increasingly being used. And one of the reasons that I embrace it is because of its umbrella nature, its capacity to absorb many identities and experiences and processes. And I have recently been reading a book by T.J. Talley called Queering Colonial Natal, Indigeneity and the Violence of Belonging in Southern Africa. And what Talley does is he uses the concept of queering as a methodology to denote resistance to the mores of Western binary gender, sexual, social, and reproductive systems imposed by colonial powers and still imposed by corporate and governmentality. It speaks to the violence of reduction and the erasure of indigeneity. the erasure in the Caribbean of indigenous peoples. When I was first doing field work in rural Jamaica in the early 1990s, and it was just a matter of course to talk about the non-existence of the Taino. Wherever I have lived and worked in the Caribbean, the indigenous populations have been written out. But now we see the ability to employ the concept of queering feminism, even in a sense that doesn't even require indigenous populations who have suffered the imposition of binaries, not only binaries of cultural constructs, but of biology. We now know through science that biological sex is not binary, but these are ideas that indigenous peoples and peoples around the world have known and lived. So there's this kind of retrieving of, through the process of decoloniality, of ideas that have been before, that have been lived, and imputing them, in engaging with them in a complex weave of new realities that we have to create that resist reduction. So that is, I think, where we have to insist that when we use terminology, when we use language, we are doing so in a way that reflects what you're doing in your book, Pat, which is to create a vibrancy and a visuality and a movement in the use of language to allow us to contain these moving parts within our conversation.
Indeed. Go ahead, Prof. Go ahead.
I just want to say one word, and that is, at age retirement now, I'm actually hesitant to go into some of that terminology again. I feel as if we have to drill down into language that is understood and shared. And I think we've been, some of that terminology has obfuscated our understanding. So for me, it is about getting that balance. Yes, as academics, we create a vocabulary that defines us and we create disciplines, but how do we also make that amenable? How do we make that understood by others? So I think it is working between that. So just thought.
Professor Gosan, please go ahead.
I was going to interrupt because we're encouraged to be rambunctious. But I do want to echo what Pat just said, because I think, one of the things, like I have worked on sexuality and thinking about sexuality for a very long time. And one of the things I find with some of the reinvention of the invention of this new language, I'm not sure we need queering feminism, because I see in lots of other work, including this book, the ways in which that work was being done, but not recognized. There's this very weird roundabout way in which, we have not recognized the kind of diversity of experiences in the global South. And when I say we, I mean like the dominant voices in scholarship. But it's not, the problem wasn't that it wasn't there, or it wasn't being articulated in texts and experiences, but it just wasn't taken up by the sort of dominant modes of methodological and theoretical scholarship. So I find, especially with queer, like in my own book, it's mostly about queer experience, and I never rely on queer theory because I find it in other elements of sort of Caribbean intellectual traditions. So this is to echo what I think. I appreciate it. I understand. I think we're on the same page in what kind of strategies we want in thinking through these ideas. But I too am not that invested in the new terminologies. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Gosan. As we continue to consider language, both in terms of theorizing, but in terms of creative works and production, I want to take a moment to recognize the chair of the Gender Advisory Board at the IGDS St. Augustine Unit, Professor Sterling Frost. We welcome you, and of course, you are welcome to share any thoughts you have as well. Dr. Hossain.
Yeah, Professor Mohammed and colleagues, thinking about language, one of the essays in the book is actually one of my favorite of Professor Mohammed's. I think it's one everyone should read, and it's called Like Sugar in Coffee. And I say sometimes that you only need that line to understand the essay, because Professor Mohammed is writing about the way that a gender consciousness infused the society. Both women and men became aware of gender. This is something we know. We're all discussing gender in the Caribbean in one way or another all the time, and amidst so many transformations. And that line, you know, for students, a gender consciousness became diffuse like sugar in coffee, just lands on students with the visuality and the visceral quality and the texture of so much of Professor Mohammed's writing, because you understand it implicitly that now we can never go back to a moment before. In fact, she calls it perhaps a more sweetened moment, because if you read Professor Mohammed's writing, she likes to take a little visual idea or an idea, and then you'll see it picked up again in words that are used as she meanders the thought. The other thing, Prof, is I feel like, and that is just, I think, on essays on Caribbean feminism, because it goes through these historical moments, comparing them to, like, you know, a Mary Wollstonecraft here and, you know, all of these other rights, but is speaking about us, from us, with words that are so easy for us to understand about ourselves. And when I think about you writing, Prof, I think about somebody who is very intuitive, because you spend so much time thinking about the words on the one hand, but on the other hand, you are working things out as you are writing them, you know, almost like a stream of consciousness. And so sometimes in your classes, to follow the meandering as you go through the thoughts, you think, well, I think, you know, and if you think about it, but when you read it in the essay, you see that flow of your mind, and I think that that's one of the beautiful things about the writing, and it is in all of those earlier essays that you can see the thoughts unfolding as you read, in a kind of gentle questioning of one step after another, literally based on the observations that are right in front of you. And I think that's such a beautiful lesson for us. Is to look around us, at our region, at our diaspora, at our space, at our politics in that way, and just find the language that speaks to the questions we're asking, and to the sweetness that others might taste, or the sounds that they might hear, or the visceral quality that they might feel, and convey it to them that way. And to me, that's fed through so much of what you try to do with language.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gosan. And before we go further, we have a comment from Ashley Dior, who says, thank you, beautiful folks, for allowing me to be at least a spectator, and was particularly impressed with Dr. McPhee and Professor Diana Fox's comments about language, and in particular queerness. As a queer trans woman myself, originally out of Trinidad, and knowing how important language is for the validity of my existence and visibility. And I think that that is something that you all have raised and can continue to talk about. And I encourage you to talk to each other. You know, we can get a little bit disruptive as we go through the evening. Just imagine, you know, you're letting your hair down a little bit more. And also to add, Professor Barriteau reminds us the work that Prof has done is creating gender policy frameworks is critical for most gender bureaus. That would be their most important contributions. They often operate within a less than welcoming bureaucratic structure. To have a strong, relevant, clear gender policy, therefore, is a very strategic intervention. So we're playing with the strong theorizing and philosophizing. We're dealing with language and what it means, and we're dealing with policy. Panelists, take us away. We encourage you to drop your comments in the chat. Interrupt if you feel so accustomed. And yes, we have another one coming. People are definitely relaxing and sharing. Thank you. This one is from Tennille Fanovich, who says, I was a very small part of the journey as Professor Mohammed framed and brought this long desire to fruition. Very proud to see you work and hope it will it will be a touchstone of her work and the disciple for a long time, and the discipline for a long time to come. Judith Wedderburn adds, so good to hear, and oh no, she was speaking directly to Professor Byron, I believe. Thank you very much to Neil for your congratulations. Panelists, we have a long discussion about language. So we want to just invite others to come on in, especially our creatives. Michael, you were supposed to finish a little bit of discussion on masculinity, and I'm tying you here in the creative discussion around language to hear what you have in mind.
You pulling me back in.
Yes.
I mean, I think, but when I got, when you know, I was rambling a little bit, but I was just discussing, you know, how I think men today kind of, well, not just necessarily masculinity, because, you know, maybe it's entertainment in general too, right? So both males and females starting to look at, you know, music and find their femininity and their masculinity within it, and maybe movies, and, you know, just that is where people look into to figure out, I guess, how to become adults, how to grow, how to live. And then you really look at like a lot of that, you know, that's being put out there, being put out there. There is the, I want to say the reconciliation, meaning the other perspective to try to fight off, but that's less popular. And, you know, Prof in that chapter kind of really does a deep dive within that back and forth answer with music and masculinity, and where boys now might be finding out how to become men. And, you know, we kind like now have that zest music, and it kind of just dives into, and to some extent it's kind of very violent and sexual, but it also have like kind of gospel zest. It have other, but it's less popular. So it's just kind of this whole realm. And I think that chapter begins to dive in that. Prof, I don't know if you want to say anything on that section a little bit to kind of, you know, just pull you in on music and masculinity.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Michael. In the chat, we have Jillian Trotman. I must acknowledge that Jillian Trotman is my own family. Very glad to see her here, and an artist in her own right. Thank you very much, she says, for this accessibility of this forum. I will be making a purposeful visit at Paperbase. Thanks to, again, all, and Patricia Mohammed, and Professor Patricia Mohammed. And as you know, you can go to Paperbase and get your book. You can also go online if you so desire. More comments coming in. This one from Kahima Baya. I hope I said that correctly. She says, this resonates for me. It's no understatement that language is power. Theme for the evening. It helps to thicken the counter narrative and move it from the fringes. And if it's one thing Professor Mohammed does, and if I may say so, is ask us to question not only language, but a lot of things that we take for granted. Judith adds, read the language we use. How about using manship when introducing men to a conversation on identity and masculinity? That's a question for the panel. How about using manship when introducing men to a conversation on identity or masculinity? Some of us in Jamaica are using this as a way of introducing the subject, and it seems to be working. So note that question, and before you answer, let's just say congratulations from Roseanne Kanhai. Welcome, welcome. Thanks so much, everyone, for this enriching session. Congrats, Pat, Prof. I look forward to reading your book, and she is departing. Thank you for your time. So panelists, the question before you, in terms of language, the discussion on language, how about using manship when introducing men to a conversation on identity or masculinity?
Can I jump in again?
Yes, of course.
In my earlier comments, I was discussing the reductiveness of language, but another aspect of language that is seemingly revealed here is its emotionality. And oftentimes in the academy, we don't think about or unpack ways in which language leads us to express and to feel. And there is an area in anthropology, which is the anthropology of emotions, which I think is particularly interesting. But language evokes emotions. It evokes strong emotions for various reasons. And it's incumbent upon us to be self-reflective about why we have particular emotional responses to certain terminology. So the term queer may lead to some very strong feelings, and it's interesting to think about why. And similarly with manship, why is that resonating? What emotional, not just intellectual, but what emotional features of experience does it evoke that is leading to its resonance? That I'm curious about that.
Yes. Anyone else jump in, Andil?
Sure. You know, I want to bring up the chapter on Sparrow, because what Pat does in this chapter is she really, you know, she looks at his whole catalog, or his catalog up to the point, I forget which year that essay was first published in, but she looks at the language and she takes us through a complex understanding of his position. So one way of looking at a song like Marajin, many of you might know this song Marajin, is to sort of contest like the clear racialization, to reduce Sparrow, you know, and the song to just that. Another way of looking at it is to talk about its ambivalence, its resonances to the same community that's being racialized in the song. What I'm saying is, she does this with so many of his songs, particularly in talking about male-female relationships. And thinking about the kind of discourse, the complex discourse on gender that Sparrow provides. And what she does in that process is give us a sense of the ambivalence of all of these gestures. So their language can be very empowering. Language can be very limiting, you know, the same. So I absolutely agree with you and appreciate, like, you know, at this moment, people feel very, you know, very emotional about, for instance, like it's very commonplace at our university now, every class begins with identification of one's pronoun. It is very important to all students. It is not something that I felt invested in growing up because, you know, with my name, I was often read as a girl, and my understanding was to like have no gender at all, like that. So there was no power for me to take on a gender, and I didn't have that emotional attachment to a gender neutral term in the way that it feels very powerful. The point that Pat makes in this wonderful analysis of Sparrow's catalog is we have to take on the full complex history more fully. We can't just latch on to sort of like easy, I guess, easy panaceas. Like if we find the right language, if we get people to say the right terms, we will solve. That is all very important, but all of these moments are filled with ambivalence and have as many opportunities as they also have, you know, failings. So that, I mean, the point I think, you know, in talking about queerness in particular is that they're all, you know, what queerness offered, thinking about queer frameworks, I think is already available to us in much scholarship, but this hasn't been appreciated for it, particularly scholarship by Black women and other women of color in feminist scholarship, and think in really kind of pushing against easy categories and easy stories. Sorry, I took very long there. I'll be quiet.
Chair, Sue-Ann, I'd
Yes.
like to add something. And it's about, again, about the importance of language and creating in terms of what we're doing, and the fact that Pat's work is, you know, the scholarship, as I said, and all of us recognize, spanning 4 decades, a body of work. And those of us in Caribbean feminist studies, you're creating a field, so to speak, not only those in the Caribbean, but persons everywhere working in this area. And language is the basis of creating critical vocabulary, and a critical vocabulary becomes the building block of a conceptual framework. So the language is very important, and language can be both exclusionary and it can be inclusive. And I think one of the ways to approach is to collect meanings and see if something that we hold on to as saying this actually means that or there. Because you know, definitions are critical, but they must not be exclusionary and have words change and have words morphed. And we know that. I mean, a very a simple example would be what did we mean by gay in the 1940s, and what we all understand today as gay, and how has that changed, and even within queer theory and in so many other areas. But language is very, very critical. And I think in feminist studies, in masculinity studies, in Caribbean studies, in the areas within which we work, we constantly have to build critical vocabularies, and we constantly have to carve our areas, because we are building to larger explanatory frameworks, and we are making knowledge claims. We are trying to wrap our hand around this thing, this area called Caribbean, and trying to speak theoretically, philosophically, practically in many areas. And what is this area that we are working with? And I mean, I just can't help when I just look at the screen, and I can't even see some of the others who are there. And just to think that, you know, what Pat has pulled together here today, our common respect and love for her and her scholarship. And all of us identify with Caribbean and with this scholarship from different disciplinary locations and boundaries, but there is a commonality that ties us together in much the same way that it ties the Caribbean together. And I think so the complexity and the sophistication of that, and not to have Caribbean be one thing, and feminist scholarship be one thing, and queer studies to be one thing, but also to introduce something that Pat has used as a title, the nuancing of that discourse. And in that nuancing, insisting on the complexity and the sophistication and the inclusivity. So Pat, again, I think that is one of the gifts that you have brought, and that your work brings all of that together for us and forces us to confront that. And again, I think one of the things she does in Sugar in My Coffee is also bring up the tensions between so-called older feminists and younger feminists, and put that squarely on the table, because it also, and I think that if you take away the layers, a lot of what passes, and again, this is not the venue for that, but this is something IGDS can grapple with in terms of a seminar, something to engage with, because a lot of what passes as tension within feminist circles, you find that it turns up in camps that do not trouble themselves with feminism, and they go by the name of insecurities and professional jealousies, and so because we are feminists, we often cringe and don't know how to deal with that. But conflict is part of life, and we have to be able to engage with that. And I think that what Pat has done, going back 20 years, is put that on the table for women's leadership. And I think, and for any area where conflict emerges. And so that was a very powerful exercise to name and to put there. And again, with the old and the younger, I'm always intrigued, because in feminist scholarship, what do we mean by young feminists? Are we speaking as chronologically? Because there are many young feminists who are quite mature in feminist analysis. So, and there are many older feminists or old feminists who are not so either mature in terms of the sensibilities, or who may be seen as junior. And so it is, again, when we talk about old and young within feminism, we have to think of it of what are we speaking to? Yes. You know, and so often I don't engage with old and young, but if you enter into a field, I think with the greatest of respect, we have to engage. We have to engage. And I often come from the position, if you're afraid powder, don't play mass. But always the greatest of respect, because I don't see, as someone who is an older feminist, I don't see persons 20 years younger than me as young. I see someone that I respect and that I will engage with, and I will not patronize or be condescending. And if I have to deal with your work, I will deal with what I see within that work. But all of that, all of what I've said, I think is embedded in that essay, sugar in the coffee. So it really could turn up in other areas, and to reinforce what Diana and Andil has said, the importance of language and the inclusivity and the commitment we all must have to continuously mining language and coining new concepts as we build this area, these several overlapping areas in Caribbean feminist studies. Thanks, Jim. A bit too long.
Thank you very much, Prof. We're going to hear from Deborah and then wrap up with comments on the chat. Dr. McPhee?
Prof. Barriteau, I'm also asking you to look at the global conversations in section 4, because myself as a student of global governance, the essay that is Global Democracy, Lessons from the Caribbean, really centers us in the conversation of how global the Caribbean is. The world is an island. And so this particular essay that looks at the ways in which global frameworks influence the work of policy, but also Caribbean realities influence the work of policy globally, is something that we need to, something that as a unit of analysis I used in my thesis, because we tend to think of global governance as a unidirectional process. But what Professor Mohammed has tabled for us is the ways in which the Caribbean teaches the world around issues of gender and gender development and policy making. So this particular essay that engages in that global challenge, the Caribbean challenging the global, is something that really opens up another kind of conversation for us. And some of us are really, the value of it is immeasurable in terms of us speaking to directions. And it also is also another kind of border crossing, because it brings us squarely into conversations. I had a part something about reflecting on long histories of women's activism when we think about democracy and security, and thinking through issues of the ways in which democracy and liberation did not work in Afghanistan, and how do we ground these conversations, these global conversations within our own context. And I looked at it in terms of where we are called upon to create a space for all societies, the gendered realities of very old societies. And that is a critical component of that global conversation, those old societies. So I'll stop there.
So many chapters to read. We're going to wrap up with our last few comments from the chat and then turn to Prof to have a final word. Liana Silochan says, thank you, Professor Mohammed, for reinforcing a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary approach. Thanks to all the esteemed contributors who are leading by example with the gender discourse. This was very inspiring. I appreciate the consideration of all disciplines and practices as they concern the Caribbean. This will be considered moving forward in post-grad research at IIR. And we know Institute for International Relations, and we know that this text will definitely be informative, a tool. Jalaluddin Khan says, congrats to Prof. Mohammed on your book and forum for discussion. There is a question, but you will take this as a take-home reflection, homework, as it were. Reflection and acknowledgement of the visual arts and visual communication seems not to have set social commitment to be acknowledged as critical form of identity in the Caribbean versus literature. So there's a point of reflection. Can Professor Mohammed comment on need for Caribbean visual arts to be invested in, as with the politics, gender, power, justice, and self-identity? So Prof, in your final comments, you can contemplate that. And then we have Ashley adding, agreeing with Professor Gosan, I was always more invested in the eradication of gender pronouns or moving towards gender neutrality. However, the challenge isn't one that can easily be undertaken because of gender normatives and pronouns entangling with each other with societal and cultural normatives. Looking forward to reading that book. And Ramona Mohammed says, from Ayub Mohammed, your dad, Prof, congratulations to my daughter, Professor Mohammed. I'm very proud of your accomplishments and the body of work that you have created. Best moment ever. And then, okay, so we have with that said, Prof, I would just like to say thank you to everyone, and thank you for all of your thoughts and your comments and your musings. And with that, we turn over to Prof. Mohammed. Prof.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you again. I feel as if I've taken all of us into the stream of consciousness journey tonight because of the book, because the book moves through many. And of course, for many people, it can be, what is the takeaway? But perhaps that takeaway is that, you know, this is reality. This is what life is about, that complexity that we are constantly working through, and us academics finding our niches, our questions, our problems that we are going to engage in. So a quick comment to some of the points that were made at the end. Eudine, I thought the point you raised about the, like, and Gabby, like sugar with coffee. Interesting enough, I was in a television talk, something the other night, multicultural television, and the young woman who was the host had been involved in the current gender and violence struggle with all these young women dying. And when we started to talk, she did not understand that those were the things we were doing 30 years ago when we began to create that visibility. So it puts on the table again for the IGDS and for all of us, how we communicate and communicate histories. And she was willing to hear, and we should divert. So I think that's one. Secondly, the point that I think Deborah was connecting as well, which I made a note on here, but I can't understand my scribblings now. So so we leave that one, Deborah. I'll come back to that. Sorry, Jill Alden, I want to just make one comment on that. You know what it is about aesthetics that is important? What for me is the essence of aesthetics. Aesthetics is about good and bad concepts in philosophy of good and bad, beauty, what is considered beautiful, what is not. And in fact, that's what art also engages in, symmetry and beauty. And I think when you translate that into how you deal with gender and how you deal with the politics of identity, that's very important. I remember when I lived in Jamaica, one of the things because I grew up in Trinidad with many different kinds of, different kind of beauty. And I lived in Jamaica, I began to see beauty differently. And the way in which you engage differently with what is beautiful, what is not, and so on. All these are parts of our understanding. And art is a very good visual. The visual is a good introduction to that. Finally, what I think, and I will end here soon, I'll just do my thank you shortly. What I think I did this book for is that it was a lifetime. It wasn't all my work, but it was the essays that I selected, I thought, provided a genealogy that I hope would constantly be critiqued, thrown out, if you like, reconstructed. It is not about a final, my final word on it. It provides that history of where we were going in. And I hope that Eudine and Rhoda and others would do the same. I would like to see us all engaged in having those texts and having that as what we also leave, because I realize that as disciplines move and move on, we lose the wisdom of the old, and we lose the thought of the old, and those are important to any discipline. And gender has to build that. So I think that was one of the reasons. But if there's a message that a lifetime of writing and art making has taken me, this is embodied in one of the last essays in the book, The Indian Snake Charmer, Other Tales, the image of story, which Andy referred to. In fact, if you begin to read this book using the cover as the first text, this Bruneian image is carried and deconstructed throughout the text. And I'll show you the cover again. I actually use this instrumentally. This is the first essay in the book, if you like. And so, and I do that almost without you realizing it's being done, but I am deconstructing that as well as you go along. Quoting from this chapter, the last chapter, decolonizing of the gaze cannot be done by focusing only on persistent, repetitive, and painful reminders of a narrative that was calculated to diminish. How do we deal with the retelling of the past as a form of empowerment while still recognizing the forms of disempowerment that shaped histories and that will continue to prevail? We are always at risk of being misrepresented. The deconstruction of language and the ownership of language that Diana engaged us in and that you all joined in is really very much part of an ownership of that. I think there's no formula for unveiling the past differently. What is invested in this exercise is conscripting an imaginative tale that does not place the Western eye as a primary and only authoritative one. Revisiting texts, photographs, or images with different lenses leads us to make connections that widen our worldviews, expand our imaginative comprehension of the collective histories of events, ritual, tradition, and creativity that we share with an ethnic group or a nation or a family. They generate rich and vibrant passages from which we can define our existence, drawing on the inalienable right we possess to construct the personal narratives of our being. I think that sums up in part of what putting this book together has also meant for me, as you know, as a retiring from the university and wanting to leave at that legacy, if you like. Finally, however, I want to end with sincere thanks, and please allow me to do this, I won't be long. I want to thank Tessa Otley, who was here with us, who was a painstaking copy editor, and Anya Pierre from Seaview Graphic Design Limited studio, who was an extraordinarily talented human herself, who I've worked with many times. To Arif and Cash Ali of Hansa Publishers, who took on the mammoth task of publishing this tome. To Darren Dorey for the uploading of the e-version on Amazon. And I have to tell you that I have my own publishing imprint, Maracas Valley Studio Productions, that deals with a range of texts, not just book form. To all who have been part of this wonderful event, Dr. Sue, for your mellifluous keeping us in check. Prof. Morgan, for your greetings. I know she had to leave. Prof. Eudine Barriteau, for our continued friendship that your presence today demonstrates. To the panelists, all whose work and thoughts I treasure as I continue to grow from the vitality of a new generation. I do put them in new generation. Prof. Diana Fox, Dr. Gabriel Hussein, Mr. Michael Molida, Dr. Deborah McPhee, and Professor Andel Gosan. Thank you all for your generosity of spirit today. To those who have been supporting in the background, Catherine Chan, artist, designer, Tanisha Charles, holding up the technology end, and Chelsea Sitahal from UE Marketing and Communications for your well-honed efficiency and personal support. Thank you. Finally, I want to embrace collectively all the colleagues who have joined us today. And while I couldn't signal anyone without leaving someone else out, I know we've done some of this through the moderator. Please know that I have recognized and treat all of your presence here as a gift of your time. Finally, to my husband, Rex Dixon, who I think might still be on, who makes all of this writing possible, who makes it creative and meaningful. Thank you, Rex. So colleagues, with that, I hand you back to Sue-Ann to take our departure. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Prof. And all I'm left to say is please be safe, please be well, and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you, folks, for coming. All the best.